What does it actually take to scale an organization that's truly a learning organization that creates a culture where you can operate in this curious way where you do make mistakes and you're able to make those mistakes without consequence, right? And I think that's actually where we miss it sometimes with leadership conversations is we're focusing so much on the individual, but ultimately that individual has a mandate to take that and scale it inside an organization. And that feels like such an essential part of this conversation because you can have a great permanent beta leader, but if their direct reports and then their direct reports and then the organization doesn't also adopt those frameworks, you're really kind of missing the real opportunity.
Hey, I'm Chris Steer, and you're listening to the Art and Science of Leadership podcast. So welcome. The show where we break down what it really takes to lead with care, clarity, and connection. This podcast is built around what we can learn from neuroscience, organizational data, lived experience, and timeless wisdom when it comes to the art and science of leadership, so that you can not only grow and learn, but also bring your teams and your organizations to a higher level. We're all about permanent beta, always learning and never done growing. Let's get into it. Welcome to another episode of the Art and Science of Leadership podcast. As usual, I am joined by my leadership partner in crime, Amy Larkin, and we are so beyond excited and over the moon about another guest joining us today, Jayne Ward, who we have had occasion to interact with over the last year or so. I've just been blown away by her strategic thinking, her critical thinking, her knowledge and insights around people leadership and organizational leadership. And in for-profit, nonprofit, big and small, Jayne has seen a lot in her career and is really one of those people that has the crystallized intelligence, the ability to see the interconnectedness of things. So Jayne, welcome to the Art and Science of Leadership podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. No pressure with that intro. So
yeah.
My best
Hey, it's just a conversation.
Up to a very generous categorization.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome, and thank you for being a part of this. And oh, by the way, like as you look over my right shoulder here, you see the trademark for Steer, which is that infinity symbol fused with beta. And what does that capture? It captures this idea of permanent beta. And it's something that all three of us have talked about at length within our organizations, the way we see the world when it comes to organizational and leadership performance. And what do we mean, team? We mean always learning, always growing, trying to find the opportunities to be better. And so let me start the conversation off this way. And Aim, I'll flip it to you first for some of your thoughts, but it's like, what we have seen in our respective careers as leading organizations, team, that intellectual humility is so powerful at the highest levels of leadership. And it definitely feels like, and not just feels, we've seen this in our own empirical data and in a lot of research, that, Amy, intellectual humility is a must-have at that C-suite, that executive leadership. Can you speak to that and some of your experience?
Oh my, it's a loaded one. I love it though. Yes. And with intellectual humility also comes the intellectual curiosity, right? They go hand in hand with each other, Chris, and Jayne. I think that, this comes down to, humility comes down to how do you build trust, right, with your team? And as a leader, I think you have to show up every day and also emulate what you're looking for from your team. And if a leader can't come in every day with the mindset of, I don't know it all, I don't, make me smarter, how do we make each other better? And the initial thing I think about when it comes to intellectual humility is what I like to always say is one of the most important pieces of a strong culture is that feedback loop, right? Mm-hmm. The more leaders can be humble and ask for that feedback on a regular basis and realize that, you know what, they might not be doing it perfectly.
Yeah.
They might be intimidating in some ways. They may actually be wrong, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is such an important component and characteristic of a leader nowadays, in order for their team to freely show up every day and
Right.
also come with great ideas and push the envelope a little bit.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're holding your team back.
Exactly.
Almost.
Exactly. No, I appreciate that reflection. And it's not humility for humility's sake. It's
Right.
humility for the mission, right? To be better. So Jayne, building on some of that commentary, you and I have talked a lot about both this intellectual humility, this permanent beta aspect, but also trust. And so how do you weave those things together from some of your perspective and your leadership of people and organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good question. And as you were talking, Amy, about kind of the individual experience of intellectual humility, intellectual curiosity, something that really popped for me is like, how do you scale that? Right? Because it's all well and good to have this, senior executive or an individual leader who's intellectually humble or has that curiosity. And ultimately, where we're going to go is how do you translate that into building a high performing organization, one that's really rooted in this idea that people produce performance. And I think that scalability is a piece that is so interesting to think about, is like, what does it actually take to scale an organization that's truly a learning organization that creates a culture where you can operate in this curious way where you do make mistakes and you're able to make those mistakes without consequence, right? And I think that's actually where we miss it sometimes with leadership conversations, is we're focusing so much on the individual, but ultimately that individual has a mandate to take that and scale it inside an organization. And that feels like such an essential part of this conversation, because you can have a great permanent beta leader, but if their direct reports and then their direct reports and then the organization doesn't also adopt those frameworks, you're really kind of missing the real opportunity.
Yeah,
that's great.
Well said. Yeah, it's unless it scales, what are we doing, right? Unless it can permeate the rhythms and the DNA of the organization, and I think that ties really nicely into what Amy said also about trying to build the trust factor as well. But exactly, like we talk often, and you both are partners with me in these conversations around some of the athletic metaphor that we bring into a lot of the conversations. And this speaks directly, Jayne, to the deliberate practice part. It's one thing to conceptualize it as an executive leader. It's one thing to intellectualize it and even model it. But how do we get that to then cascade and connect to our next level leaders? How do we create almost the post-game debrief so that we can ensure it's connecting back to the team? And so I'll start with one thought, and then Amy, jump in terms of how can we pull this through? How do we pull this concept of permanent beta through the organization? And one thing that Jayne made me think about in this very moment is when we have a rhythm around strategic planning, for example, and how we are executing against our plan, right? Or the playbook, being able to model the permanent beta of what did we learn? What did I learn from this last quarter, from this last month, where I can be better? And then being able to have that zone of trust, of curiosity that you all, to use the words that you all are using, to then percolate some of those ideas. That's just one small example, but what are some other rhythms, team, that can help to cascade, as Jayne said, and scale this kind of intellectual humility?
I mean, oh gosh, Chris, the very first thing that comes to mind is a fail-safe environment, right?
Yeah.
And Jayne, you just made mention of that as well. You know, when you are taking a look back to the plan, right? How can leaders acknowledge the effort, right? And the learnings that came from trying? Maybe it didn't work, and foster that fail forward kind of environment, I think is really, really important. That's where the best ideas come from, as we all know. It's not because everybody was playing safe. It's because people were pushing the envelope. They were trying to get better. They were trying to learn. And, 9 times out of 10, those ideas don't work. And so as a leader, to embody and to promote and encourage your team that failing is okay, right? And Chris, you and I talked about this a couple of months back. We used to, back in the day, we used to have an award every year for the biggest failure in the organization. And it was meant to acknowledge the effort that was put in, and it didn't work. And that was okay, because everybody was bought in. Everybody was contributing in a really, really impactful way. And they were each learning. And I feel like, I think we could all three agree that some of our greatest lessons as leaders come from our greatest failures.
No doubt. No doubt. Well said. And I love that example. It's highlighting we're trying to create confidence. We're trying to create boldness. And I've learned a lot from Jayne talking about trust and how vital that is. Jayne, you've been in small and large organizations. What are some of the ways that you see we can scale some of this curiosity, the intellectual humility, this permanent beta?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting needle to thread, because you don't necessarily want to say, okay, go take a big risk with this major revenue generating channel, right? Because we have to all hit our EBITDA and P&L goals and all of those things. And you want to create this opportunity for regular innovation inside of an organization. And there are some places like big tech firms where they set aside these hackathon days every quarter, where it's really just about like, let's put down those core pieces of our work and really step into the space of dreaming, of innovating, of learning, of testing and trying. And then I think you also have organizations where the leaders are really good at defining the what and explaining the why. And then they say to their teams, okay, you iterate and help me think about the how. And giving that sort of freedom to create, knowing what the goal is and being okay with it not necessarily being exactly what you would have done. So much of this permanent beta mindset is about ceding control, which can be extremely difficult for folks, especially at the executive leadership level, where they're being held accountable to really high watermarks and goals. And also ceding that control is a big part of engendering that trust, right? I trust you that you're going to get to the same place, the thing that we need to do, even if it's not in the exact way that I would do it. Yes. And I think leaders are really uncomfortable with that because it's unknown. And it does require more management. It can be more time intensive. Yeah. And I think it requires you to be really good at setting expectations and goals on the front end, which ties back to this strategic planning piece, is how do we set the goalpost and then let people run the plays.
Right on. Love that. Perfect metaphor there. You beat me to the punch, because we were definitely, all three of us, we are of the same neural pathway right now. This is about performance. Right? We're not putting this as adjacent to performance. This is about performance. And the goalposts, this comes up often. We're not talking about moving the goalposts closer to make it easier. No, it's just, is there a different path to get there? One that is driven by ideas that maybe we haven't contemplated yet, or maybe aren't coming just from me. They're coming from all corners of the organization. So am I listening? Right? Am I creating, as you said, Jayne, a forum for that? And Amy, as you said, am I rewarding the boldness and the curiosity? That's right. Because it is a performance imperative. Quite frankly, we all three of us could sit here and say, it's in fact mission critical that we create this space to be curious, to think differently, to play to win. What organization have you ever been a part of where you won and you consistently played it safe? We haven't, right? No. And I'm so grateful that you brought up the performance piece of this, because that's exactly what we're talking about. And this is not just empirically from what the three of us have seen. This goes into the broader surveying and research across organizational development, and even, quite frankly, what we've seen within the neuroscience community as well. But I mean, Amy, we're not putting performance up for grabs, are we?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
I think, complacency kills organizations, right? And I think that, a great mentor of mine once said to me, you always want to be slightly uncomfortable, because if you're not growing, and you're not learning. And again, I go back to watching quite a few leaders that have come across my career journey that have settled for complacency, and they've just kind of, been okay with that. But the needle stops moving.
Yeah.
Right. The play gets stalled, and the organization is not moving in the direction that typically the highest level of leadership wants it to. And so that is something I think that always needs to be top of mind for an individual. Is, have you gotten complacent? Are you uncomfortable in a good permanent beta way?
Right. No, I love that. And I'm glad we used the word, right? The discomfort, the uncomfortability. We all know that, like, I just was watching something from Ben Horowitz recently on the hard things, like run to the hard things, run to the pain, because that's where the success is. That's where your breakthrough is going to be, right? And that really is aligned with permanent beta, which is, I'm not going to be comfortable. I'm not going to stay comfortable, because that's not how we're going to grow as an organization. And Jayne, you and I have talked recently about the idea that, boy, at the end of the day, it's this mindset, it also, you could connect it to emotional quotient, but the mindset drives the bus, right? The mindset, organizational mindset drives the bus. And I know that you are driving this and have driven this in many different organizations, but what are some of the plays in the playbook to help create more of that organizational mindset, to perform and to push yourself beyond complacency?
Yeah, I think sometimes you'll get leaders sort of saying in town halls, right, we're a learning organization, and that doesn't really translate into anything meaningful for the line staff or the team sort of further down in the org structure, because it lacks the observable behaviors, the things that we want to see, right? It's the difference between saying we're a learning organization and saying we're an organization that honors how we got here. And we don't say this is how we've always done it. We ask, how might we do it better, right? And that's the mentality that we want you to bring into conversations. And that's the question that we want you to ask, right? It's an easy question, not an easy question. It's actually a very hard question. It is, though, a simply stated question that can be asked in most contexts, right? From deciding if we're going to change over our payroll software to deciding, are we going to pivot some key things that have been pillars of our strategic planning process, right? How might we do it better or do it differently as we think about it in the context of our goals? That question being really an embedded part of people's thinking is a big piece of this. I would also share, like, this concept around intellectual humility and intellectual curiosity is not just about, like, making changes all the time, right? We're not talking about, like, always being a tinkerer. We're talking about making some educated, thoughtful guesses, because you don't want to give your team this, like, constant change that actually can squash innovation and make it actually feel unsafe to try, because there's no stability. It's about looking at what's around you, micro and macro level, and being able to say, okay, these are the areas where I think we do have gains to be made. Let's talk as a team about whether or not you agree with that and how we might do it together, versus saying we're just going to change it all because I had, like, a fever dream last night.
Exactly. Right. No, that's right.
I mean, we've all seen it, right? It happens.
It does. And I mean, quite frankly, I was just working with an organization this week where there is some retention challenge because of the consistency and pace rather, not because the pace of change. And so much of it happening, there is a little bit of it feels like there is shifting sands, and that becomes more of a retention challenge. Right. So it's like everything else in leadership, right? There's nuance, There's nuance to permanent beta. There is nuance to how you scale it into your organization. There is nuance to ensure that we are actually learning and appropriately measuring our effort and commitment and intention around it. And that's why it requires you to be able to hold opposing thoughts in your head at the same time, right? If it were easy, team, everybody would do it, right? Amy, let me give you your last word as it relates to, the building up of this muscle, right? And one of those things is just the ability to really teach people to ask questions. And so much of this is like, we don't really, in many respects, we're not really teaching our managers, especially that middle manager, how to have the human skill component of asking questions, of encouraging questions, of developing some of that thought capital. But give me some of your leadership thinking on that, Amy, in terms of trying to provide more of that human skill around asking good questions, or just the environment to create the curiosity.
Absolutely. And again, I think it comes down to leaders being a little bit more vulnerable themselves, right? And emulating that behavior. How can you as a leader bring your next level of managers up, right? And make them feel safe in that environment. And I go back to, how can you make learning contagious, right? Mm-hmm. How do you make it contagious? And, some of the examples that I give to, some of the leaders and executives I coach is, don't always feel like you have to own and drive the meeting, like from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. when the meeting closes, right? Invite the commentary, invite the thought, invite the ideas, call people out on the table. You know that, the person across from you has something very important to say. They're not going to say it because they're intimidated and they're a little bit fearful of how the audience will react, right? And so how do you make learning contagious, and how do you help that next level to build the confidence that they need to have a point of view at the table and to share it openly?
Love that. Make learning contagious. Great way to sum us up from the Amy Larkin perspective. Jayne, you have already blessed us with incredible nuggets in this conversation. I've written several of them down, as I always do when I talk to you. But give us your bottom line here when it comes to trying to establish this permanent beta mindset as more of a rhythm and a habit within the organizational context. If you had to do your amazing synthesis here, what would you land on?
Yeah. Early in my career, I got a piece of feedback from a much more senior leader about striking this balance between what do you want people to do and how do you want them to feel. And I think so much of this intellectual curiosity, intellectual humility is finding that synergy between those two things, because if people don't feel safe, they're not creative. If people feel burnt out, they're not going to produce. If folks don't feel like they have a voice and their perspective matters, they're not going to share it with you. And all of those things are directly correlated to what we want people to do, which is be really high performers, be really engaged employees, come with the creative, risky ideas because they know there's a space for them at the table. And I think it's one of the things that's so hard for a lot of leaders is they don't want to spend as much time in like the how do we want people to feel question and how do we do that? Because it's harder to calculate the ROI. It takes longer to see the data that supports it, because you're likely not going to see it until you run your turnover numbers at the end of the year, until you look at your quarterly closeouts, right? And start to think about what's the people ingredient that created this performance. And so I would say, as you're thinking about creating this learning culture, asking yourself both of those questions: what do we want people to do? And then how do we want them to feel?
Wow. Perfect. Way to land the plane, my friend. Appreciate you. Jayne, thank you. Amy, thank you. Great conversation today. Remember, better performance, consistent, sustainable performance is directly correlated to how much learning, curiosity, permanent beta you have within your organization. So more to come on this in future episodes for sure, because I know we've merely scratched the surface today, but thank you both. And thank you for joining us for another episode.